So, what actually makes something revolutionary? Something is revolutionary when it not only totally disrupts the established order, but it replaces the established order with a new order. And in so doing, it changes the dynamics of everything around it. The discipline of being a crafter for the web continues to morph and change at a rapid pace. As more and more people connect to the web and the myriad of different devices that we use increases, we've seen major shifts driven by technological change. With this litany of new frameworks and processing languages, our new tools have not only changed our field, but they have changed our lives as developers and designers. They're giving us new capabilities that we can then transform into new opportunities. And it's this behavioral change that's revolutionary. To quote Clay Shirky, "Revolutions don't happen when we adopt new technologies. They happen when we adopt new behaviors." So before we can really dive into this rise and importance of this web revolution, and really to be able to understand how our tools like Django or jQuery or Sass or Python can actually transform our behavior, we first need to define what we mean by behavior. So for our context, I'm using the Fogg behavioral method. Dr. B.J. Fogg leads the Persuasive Tech Lab at Stanford University. And in the mid to late 90s, he used methods from experimental psychology to demonstrate that computers can change people's thoughts and behaviors. His model states that in order to form a new behavior, we must be sufficiently motivated, have the ability to perform the behavior, and be triggered to perform this behavior. So behavior becomes the result of your motivation times your ability plus this trigger. Motivation. This is anything that gets you to do something. We are each motivated by different things. For some, it's money. For others, it's freedom. For others, knowledge, security. So we can actually see that motivation is subjective and personal. So thus, it's really not good to rely on it to influence behavior. I mean, we all know what happens to many New Year's resolutions. You start out really excited, and then you hang out on the couch, right? So ability. Much like motivation, ability varies for each individual. And ability has to do with how simple or easy something is to complete. Simplicity is a function of your scarcest resource, what factor you are missing at that moment in time when you are trying to complete this task. If you don't have 10 minutes and the task takes 10 minutes, it's going to be really hard. Conversely, if you have $100 to spend and it costs $50 to complete it, it might be a lot easier for you. Persuasive technologies focus on making things as simple as possible. Another way of looking at this is persuasive technologies focus on making things accessible to all abilities. Triggers. A trigger can take many forms, such as an alert or notification. Whatever form it takes, successful triggers have 3 characteristics. First, we notice the trigger, this squirrel. Second, we associate the trigger with a target behavior, running after the squirrel. And third, if we want to succeed, the trigger actually has to happen when we are both motivated and able to perform the behavior. In this case, the dog can only run after the squirrel if it's not being held by its owner and being restrained. Without an appropriate trigger, a behavior will not occur, even if both motivation and ability are high. So this is a graphical representation of Dr. Fogg's model. Behaviors succeed above this red line, and they fail here. So we can see that if a trigger happens, right, but we're not sufficiently motivated or actually able to do it because it's really hard to do, we're going to fail. We're going to be here. Conversely, if we have this trigger, but our task is really hard to do, it'll require really, really, really high motivation to make it happen. Effective persuasive technologies that cause behavioral changes will boost either motivation or ability. So our takeaway is this: motivation, ability, and trigger must converge and be present at the same moment for a behavior to occur. When a behavior does not occur, at least one of these three elements is missing. So now that we have this idea and understanding of behavior, we can better comprehend exactly how the design of our tools impacted our behavior in such a way that led to this disruptive, revolutionary change. To do so, we've got to time travel a little bit back to the mid to late aughts. The pain from the crash was fading. New startups like YouTube and Amazon were part of our lives. Rumblings were being heard and felt in web development. More and more businesses were coming online and wanting websites or wanting to undergo this Web 2.0 beautification. And browser wars were in pretty full flight. New JavaScript frameworks started popping up, and they were all aimed at addressing the API inconsistencies across all of our browsers in hopes of trying to provide a better authoring experience for developers. In 2006, John Russing released jQuery. Interestingly, as we see, it was not the first framework that came up. But it did three things that no other JS framework at the time had managed to address. First, it provided a very, very, very simple approach to DOM manipulation with its chaining methods and its sizzle selector engine. Second, it launched with documentation from the get-go. Prototype, which was released earlier, took over a year to release its documentation. And even though it was actually adopted by the Rails framework, it was adopted before it had sufficient documentation. jQuery launched with great docs from the get-go. And lastly, jQuery launched with an invitation to participate and opened up the possibility for anyone to contribute. By its second day, a man by the name of Michael Geary contributed the first plugin. Now, prior to this, at least in front end, and at least for JavaScript, it was incredibly difficult to contribute back to the actual language. We've been working around this by creating these libraries. The only way to do it was to participate on the board. But truthfully, who could get anything done on the scrolling board? In fact, it's a little safe to say that it's the political agenda of the browser manufacturers and the closed process that led to these inconsistent nightmares and frustrations for developers. jQuery allowed developers with sufficient motivation and ability to participate how they wanted to or could. jQuery created an environment where motivated people could get things done without barriers. And it's been a success. Casting all the grumbling aside, this don't use jQuery, I know, it's still one of the most popular JS frameworks. So regardless of where your opinion falls, what I think is most important is that jQuery's design decisions proved to be a winning combination that really influenced many successful front-end frameworks and languages to come, ultimately paving the way for other projects like Node.js, and we could arguably say the renaissance of JavaScript. Collaboration brings immense value to tools and the individuals. It means the prospect for new ideas that can make our tools better. It means the potential for more new ideas that can make our environments better. Lowering the barriers to entry, in software at least, is often accomplished by having documentation and providing a way for others to contribute. Adrian knew this when he and the Gang of Four started out to build Django. So back in 2003, it was cutting edge to use relational databases to power websites and to start to draw a rich relationship of information with this data. Django came out of a very specific need of a local newspaper. And when it was open sourced in 2004 and 2005, some of the sentiment to its success resonated that it had great documentation and a pluggable interface. Coming out of the gate with documentation is not common practice for projects during this time. In a blog post, as I was searching and learning more, I was surprised by how many numerous voices were chiming in emphatically to the, yes, it was the fact that I could look at the docs and get it up and running, and the examples worked, and it was easy. According to Mike Malone, an emphasis on providing quality documentation with a new patch. Django had an emphasis on always providing quality documentation with a new patch. So if you wanted to contribute, you immediately had to document it. Next to documentation, Django was easier to set up and get up and running than popular Python frameworks at the time. Being able to easily get up and running and have good documentation means that anyone with access to the computer, internet, and a small will to try it out can. And this is great. Lastly, one of the most important ingredients for change, community. And it's really an honor to be here in your community and feel like a welcome member, even though this is my first time. I'm really excited to get to learn from you all and to see what you do in your community to foster inclusivity, respectfulness, and diversity. And as we saw with jQuery, contribution is essential. It's a way to give motivated people a way to participate. And if you lower that barrier to threshold, as Django did with documentation, you set yourself up for a really rich ecosystem. So Django also had the ability to contribute to it with plugins. Now, contribution is actually a part of the ethos of the web and the internet, but its foray into more front-end disciplines like CSS, design, UX, UI, JS is actually a relatively recent development within the last 7 years. Right. So around the same time that jQuery was making its way through the Alexa top 10, CSS was ready for a change. So what was going on in our style sheets? Carrying the torch and flying the web standards high, we wanted a way to rid our HTML of the ugly tag soup that was happening. And we wanted an easy way to be able to achieve the design aesthetic popular at that time. Right now it's flat UI. I ask you to go back into the days of gradients and rounded corners and super bubbly websites. And also, 960 pixels, because that was the best and only way to design your website. And we also had tons of IE requirements to deal with, right? So while we had CSS3 modules, and they were starting to pick up, they were, as was de facto in that time, kind of poorly implemented across different browsers. And so instead, we ended up with a ton of complexity that we had to manage. We had to write a bunch of browser and vendor prefixes and try to remember when the browser would implement it and go back and depreciate it in our code. So in actuality, The rise of the CSS preprocessor was inevitable because we really needed a way to survive this maze of complexity, to be able to do our jobs. So like jQuery, Sass was really but one of the many tools that was promising a solution for our style sheets. So how did it emerge the victor? Code-wise, it's always been touted as one of the most feature-rich, but power has its cost. Its initial syntax, which was white space only, and the runtime dependencies of Ruby were huge hurdles, right? This makes something really, really, really hard to do. And so front-end devs either had to be incredibly motivated or have some knowledge of how to navigate their way around these languages that just weren't common to us. And so for that reason, less really remained a powerful contender. It was much easier to get up and running. On the surface, it provided you with the same features. So why not? And it looked less foreign because it looked like CSS syntax. So what happened? The Sass team learned from less. Natalie adopts the curly SCSS syntax, which helps lower the threshold to entry by making it more CSS-like. But still, I postulate that Sass ultimately excelled for two reasons. The first, Sass prioritized people and their contributions from the get-go. It designed community into the language. It was never an afterthought. They were part of it. And second, at the time it was released, it came with its pluggable companion, Compass. And Compass really removed obstacles and barriers to participation. It allowed people to create and reuse Sass libraries. It provided us with a simple structure, and it made it much easier to get up and running in this new tool that was slightly outside the comfort zone for many front-end devs. And we ran with it. Even though some of us had to learn Ruby to make these gems and share our code, this was something that we wanted, because for the first time, we could actually share things beyond just a blog post or a tutorial. Sass opened up a way to contribute as a CSS and UI developer and designer. So much so, interestingly enough, that when Hampton put out the call in 2013 to help people work on the newer version of Sass, libsass, that runs without a Ruby dependency, is much faster. A front-end dev that had never written C++ stepped up to do this because, in this case, he was so motivated by wanting to have a faster version of Sass that he said, I'm going to learn how to fix this myself. And so Sass continued to better itself and continued to lower the barrier into entry. The release of libsass means that we no longer have to release our extensions as Ruby gems. We can release them as plain old SCSS and CSS in the language that we are comfortable with. And we can now tap into the Node ecosystem, where, as we're all familiar, there's a ton of new and amazing front-end tools available at our disposal. For the longest time, we couldn't easily extend or contribute back to our language. This provided us a way to do it. And of course, we could try to join the working group, but up until recently, it hasn't really been possible to effect immediate change via that process. The feedback process for getting features into the web is a bit broken. A lot of our work as developers has actually been to circumvent this really slow-moving process from the spec team. And there's a process in place for a really good reason. We can't just have everyone creating what they think would be great on the web. That would be impossible. But this process is slow-moving, and it's tedious, and it's demanding. And the current process makes it really hard for people to contribute, even if they have the skills and are sufficiently motivated. Where would we be if we had to ask for permission all the time? So a group of individuals tired of waiting for browser implementators to come around and tired of asking for permission, decided to take matters into their own hands. The extensible web movement is now an official W3C working group that's changing the process by which people can contribute to the web. And they're doing this by applying the same patterns that we saw of effective, persuasive technology. The same things that we learned through building our own tools and our libraries. They want to make it easy to get started, and they want to keep it fun and fast-moving. Their manifesto is crafted to correct what is historically a hard incentive to imbalance. Currently, developers are kind of a bit disincentivized to look at standards until they're already years along in their time frame. And once those standards are delivered, they kind of fall short because the developer expectations didn't really get into the working groups. So we have these things that come out that actually don't really meet our needs. So what does the group want to do? They want to lower the threshold to entry, and they want to keep the motivation needed to gather ideas as low as possible. And they're doing this by rethinking their organizing tools. They're leveraging GitHub because it's where the masses are, instead of these old mailing lists that you had to join and subscribe to. And they're using GitHub because they can track people's contributions and interact with people in an open, easy way. So how's this going to work? The basic plan is anyone with sufficient motivation and ability can hit the ground running by first submitting a proposal openly in GitHub. Then the developer will use JavaScript to build a prototype. Yes, this is our new lingua franca of the web. And with this prototype, they can start to get feedback through users and people and iterate on it. And this keeps going until at a certain point, if there's enough interest, an actual proposal can be made. So this means that by the time it gets to the W3C, it's already been tested and used, and lots of bugs have already been spotted. And so the developer can work with the spec writer with an actual living prototype, not some concept or idea of how this is going to behave, but a working version of this. And basically, how the developer is releasing a polyfill, or what this movement is calling a prolyfill. And now, even before the browsers have adopted it, we can continue to use this new technology by including it as a polyfill. And once it's available in the web, then we don't have to use it anymore. We use the native web's version. I think this is incredible. This, to me, is a whole new revolution for developers and designers and our relationship with the web browsers and implementers. So we're removing sort of the magic from the web and making it something that's open to everyone. And we know what works for us because we've already been doing this for over a decade. We are now finally free to experiment. We can get out there without having to depend on these large institutions, rules, and regulations. Finally, the browsers can't contain us this time. They need us. This is a fundamental new way of thinking about innovation. Our tools have created a participatory culture. Traditional rules that we have for institutions don't work anymore. And this is really important because it's both the ability for collective participation and collective action that are the necessary ingredients for change. So what are these new behaviors? First, we're enabling groups and individuals to try radical things by removing these barriers to collaboration. Second, we're creating environments in which people who want to get something done can, and they can do so in a timely fashion. And more importantly, we're creating encouraging and supportive environments that nurture our creativity and our unique individuality. So fascinatingly, if we were actually to go back and kind of plot the growth of our tools and sort of front end and web, you would get what we know of as the power log graph. In network science, this graph is represented by a small world network. So small world networks are characterized by being made up of small, tightly connected groups that connect to larger nodes. Each node is independent, but also connected, and it's the connection of these nodes that forms the whole network. So there are two advantages to small world networks. The first is that they're resistant to damage. Their design makes them extremely effective. Removing one node could have an effect, but it's usually not a huge effect because that node is but one of many points. So it's not the sole connection. So the network can heal itself easily if a node falls off. Secondly, small world networks act both as amplifiers, so they're very good at getting information out, and filters. They're really good at weeding out cruft and things that we don't want to know. So what's incredible, perhaps without even us noticing, is that we've designed our web communities for growth and resilience. Given that we are so skilled at creating a resilient network, a network rooted in valuing the contributions and uniqueness of each community member. And given that we can do this in such a short amount of time, I really believe that we have a lot to contribute back to society beyond just great websites, apps, and digital experiences. Citizens the world over are already calling for change. I believe, along with many others, that this change will only come through a participatory revolution. I predict that we are going to see a shift from these technical problems to the interpersonal. It's going to become more about the people-to-people, the human connection, the act of working together physically and intellectually, meshing our ideas and configuring them to come up with another new thing. It's going to be about how we work together and organize ourselves within our environments, how we learn to accept and deal with different viewpoints. These are our next critical challenges. I believe that our greatest contribution as developers, designers, crafters, and creators for the web is the knowledge that we have learned from scratching our own itch. The knowledge about how to build resilient participatory communities. We are successful practicing models of a participatory culture. We are more than just web developers and designers. We are the leaders of one of the largest movements in the world. Code literacy holds immense power. It's more than just a job or a career change. It is an opportunity to participate in the largest human-powered information network in history. It's up to each one of us whether or not we want to create these opportunities where they are needed most. This will vary by our communities, our own motivations and abilities, but we all have the opportunity to create them. What's important is that as we create and experiment, we must remember to encourage and reward participation along every step. As we expand our participatory ethos beyond our tech communities, we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. Let's be kind to each other. Let's be helpful to each other. Let's be humble. Let's make sure that we acknowledge what our own fears and insecurities are and not project those onto others. That we're open to these different viewpoints. Above all, just keep creating. Keep trying new things. It's not silly to release a little application that only you will use, or that you built over the weekend because it inspired you or you had fun. That's actually what's incredibly valuable. The fact that you're letting yourself be creative and to create. So if we do this, we will continue to innovate. And given what we've just observed, our innovations will most certainly continue to offer the potential to be revolutionary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudina. We have time for a couple of questions. So if you want to ask them, please shuffle maybe here. Just let's create a queue here for questions.
Oh, wonderful.
Hello, Russell.
Thank you so much for that. It was wonderful. Towards the end, you spoke about how we are a fantastic model for participatory culture and how that sort of thing can, or we might be a model for society more generally, which is obviously true. Like, I believe it's true. But we've also made some massive missteps, and there are some huge things we've done really badly. So, how do we? What can we practically do to improve the cultures that we have ourselves, but also to make sure that broader society doesn't make the same mistakes that we made all over again?
Good question, right? I mean, I think that parents, when they have kids, they're like, oh, I hope my kid doesn't make these same mistakes, right? But sometimes they do, and it's the process of actually letting them fail first that helps them. So I think it's okay that we make mistakes. I think the best thing that we can do is learn how to correct ourselves very quickly, right? And to make sure that once we've corrected ourselves, that we don't keep making that same mistake. So that would be my recommendation. Yes, we've had a lot of problems, but I think what we can focus on is if we make it past those problems, and that becomes more interesting, right? We failed, we changed. How did we do that? Keep that memory in our mind and pass that on to others as our collective knowledge. And it's not that all the problems can be solved the same way either, right? So while we might look at someone who's failing and be like, oh my gosh, if only they had listened to me, they would totally not have run into that problem. The reality is we don't know their whole environment. So what we've learned could really affect them in one little way, but I feel like we can't be super magnanimous to say that everything we've learned is going to be a solution for someone else. So sharing, and yeah, just having that humility to be like, whoops, that was wrong. I'm not going to do that again.
Hi, I'm Idan. You touched on this sort of the sentiment that came up a little while ago, the JavaScript fatigue sentiment, where people are building, this wild woolly world of things in the Node ecosystem, but it's also a problem in front end, and these polyfills, they come out every Tuesday and Thursday, and I was away for a week, and now all of a sudden there's there's post CSS, I should be using that. How do we find a way to balance the desire to run forward, or what are your thoughts on balancing the need for stability? Because it is an impediment to new people getting in. I see people coming in, and they're like, what should I use? And I'm like, well, until lunch, you should use this. After lunch, you should really check something else out. What are your thoughts on how to reconcile those two, sort of that tension?
Very good question. Well, as I ended with, I definitely do really believe that having all of these new frameworks come out on Tuesday and Thursday is the best thing ever, even if it means not knowing what to do, or not knowing if you should quickly jump on that bandwagon or not. I mean, I think it really depends on the constraints of your project, right? If you're on a project where you can use fast-moving technology and that's one of your mandates and ethos, then hey, you get to be lucky and try that stuff out and write about it and share about it and put that information out there for people so that they know when they should make that decision. But for new people coming in, I mean, I definitely think the fundamentals of the web are still the fundamentals of the web. So starting there is a good thing. And I also feel in general there's like a kind of like the stable stack, you know, there's like, okay, well, we know that most people are having some type of pre or post processor, so here are your options. Each one has pros and cons. It's not like one is better than the other, they just all have pros and cons, and it's, I mean, think about it, the process of evaluating is actually really good for us as humans. It is a little exhausting, and psychology proves to the point that too many choices is actually really bad. But I think that you know, learning to make those decisions is actually really good and good for us outside of our field as well, to be able to kind of objectively and rationally hear something and say, oh, okay, I can do some research. This is XYZ. How do I fit that in? But yeah, I mean, it's super tough. I think the other thing is just to not feel nervous that you're not on the coolest, hippest thing. Like, it might die. So who knows what cool and hip is anymore? I think it's just actually kind of a mindset, like being excited, being willing to try, not being afraid, and not being so dogmatic about anything. That, I think, is like really what the hip new ethos could be. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Or do you want to? Okay.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. And sorry. You were talking about all the great things that have been created, and if I think about that, I think what you also need is time to do this. So, and obviously in our world, time also means money, so I need money to get the time, or the other way around. And this has also been discussed a lot in the Django community and other communities over the last months. How can you finance open source work and stuff like that? Though, have you any opinions on that or any ideas on that? How we can improve the situation? How you can finance this work or make this work possible or easier?
Right, this is a big question I think has been around for a lot of open source communities for a long time. I mean, my instinctual internal gut, as developers, we make companies a lot of money, And the leadership in these companies, unfortunately, is probably not as hip to the ethos of open source, so they're not contributing back. But I really think that we, as a community, could start to put that pressure on them, because they're using these tools. They're getting a lot of value out of someone's open source work and not paying for anything. And before, they used to pay hundreds, thousands, millions of dollars for this stuff. So why can't they give that back to us? So maybe one idea is, as our community in force is really a rallying letter to our corporations that are making substantial profits off of our work, to reinvest that into the foundations such as the Django Foundation or the SAS foundations. So you can have this sort of multi-level approach where you've got the people in the offices rallying for it, the foundations to help out and kind of take those funds and also make sure that they get distributed and kind of be that point of liability, if you will. But yeah, I really think that the money is there. It's just not coming to us.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Claudina, for this incredible talk. And thank you for joining us here in this Django event.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And truly, can we please give these organizers a huge, huge round of applause? And the volunteers.